Ao wasn't supposed to fall in love in Seoul. She had plans. Open the restaurant, go home to Lagos, build her empire. Simple. Logical. Safe. Then Han Seung-jun walked in on New Year's Eve with his dying mother and eyes that held decades of loneliness, and every plan she'd made turned to smoke. He didn't pursue her with aggression. He pursued her with hope, showing up each morning with her favorite breakfast, learning Yoruba phrases to make her smile, sitting in her restaurant for hours just to watch her work. "I'm not good at this," he'd admitted last week, fingers gentle on her face despite the violence they'd committed. At being soft. At wanting something more than power. "Teach me." She'd been teaching him. Teaching them both. Now, hands bound in a warehouse that stank of gasoline and malice, she felt oddly calm. Because she knew him. Knew the way he loved, absolute and all-consuming. Knew he was coming not with rage but with terrified devotion. The door opened quietly this time. He stepped through, and their eyes met across the space. No words needed. Just the recognition that they'd both been looking for each other long before they'd met, and nothing, not danger, not distance, not death itself, would separate them again. Welcome to Afro-Korean Seoul Diaries. Please like, share, and subscribe. The atmosphere in Ao's fusion restaurant was electric, the Seoul skyline twinkling through the glass. The peace shattered when Han Seung-jun's security detail began harassing a server. Ao didn't hesitate. She stood tall, her rich, deep brown skin glowing under the golden lights, her hourglass figure poised with authority as she crossed her arms against the men in suits. "Step away from her," she commanded, her voice level but ironclad. From the table, Han Seung-jun rose. He was a pillar of pale ivory skin and sharp, lethal angles, his monolid eyes widening in genuine shock. No one spoke to his men that way. Behind him, his mother, Han Yuna, watched with an amused, knowing smile. The tension was thick enough to cut, but in that moment of defiance, Seung-jun didn't see an enemy. He saw the first person brave enough to look past his scars and see the man. The next morning, the bright Seoul sun glinted off the glass of Ao's hotel. She stepped out to find Seung-jun leaning casually against a black luxury sedan, looking entirely too comfortable. He held 2 coffee cups and a bag from a Nigerian bakery he'd tracked down across the city. "We're closed," Ao said, her hands on her hips, her expression one of guarded annoyance. "I'm not here for the restaurant," Seung-jun countered, a slight smirk playing on his lips, the thin white scar on his eyebrow twitching. "I'm here to apologize. Properly." The setting shifted to a warm, traditional sunroom. Ao sat on a floor cushion, her laughter ringing out as she shared a meal of jollof rice and kimchi with Han Yuna. Seung-jun sat beside them, his usual cold demeanor melting into a rare, vulnerable softness. "She has a spine, this one," Yuna whispered, her eyes crinkling as she adjusted her oxygen tube. Seung-jun looked at Ao, not with the gaze of a businessman, but with a growing, terrifying devotion. For the first time, the scars on his face didn't look like marks of war. They looked like history he wanted to share. In a private booth overlooking the Han River, the air turned electric. Seung-jun leaned forward, his black suit unbuttoned at the collar, his intense focus entirely on Ao. The candlelight danced on her deep brown skin as she offered a shy smile, her fingers trembling slightly around her wine glass. "I don't do slow, Ao," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "I see what I want, and I take it." At a high-end gala, Ao was a vision in a fitted gold dress, commanding the attention of every investor in the room. When a businessman lingered too long on her arm, the temperature dropped. Suddenly, Seung-jun was there, his hand firm and possessive on the small of her back. His expression was deadly, a silent warning to the room. "She is mine." Ao felt the heat of his palm through the silk, a mixture of shock and a traitorous thrill racing through her. The ride home was silent and heavy with unspoken desire. In the darkened back seat of the sedan, city lights blurred into streaks of neon. Seung-jun sat close, his hand resting heavy on Ao's thigh. "Tell me to stop," he challenged, his breathing shallow, his jaw clenched with the effort of restraint. Ao didn't speak, she only leaned into him, her natural hair falling loose from its bun as the world outside the tinted windows disappeared. Golden dawn flooded the penthouse. Ao lay wrapped in white sheets, her natural curls spread across the pillow, looking at Seung-jun with newfound trust. He sat shirtless on the edge of the bed, his lean, muscular frame relaxed. The hardness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a look of pure adoration as he reached out to touch her face. In the quiet of the morning, the Mafia prince and the restaurant queen were simply two souls who had found home. The peace was short-lived. Back at the fusion restaurant, a customer leaned too close to Ao, his hand brushing her waist. From across the room, Seung-jun's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. He approached like a predator, his fists clenched, the scars on his face stark against his pale skin. The air in the restaurant turned cold as his possessive rage flared, a reminder that loving a man like Seung-jun meant living in the eye of a storm. The storm finally broke. Ao sat bound to a metal chair in a cold, industrial warehouse, her face bruised but her spirit unbroken. Shadowy figures moved in the darkness, but Ao kept her chin high. She refused to beg. She knew the man who loved her, and she knew the carnage that was coming for those who had dared to touch her. The warehouse doors exploded. Through the smoke and flickering red emergency lights, Seung-jun appeared like a lethal ghost. He was in tactical gear, his face splattered with blood that wasn't his own, his eyes filled with a murderous, terrified rage. He didn't stop until every threat was neutralized, his gaze locked on Ao even as he fought his way to her side. In the quiet of a private hospital room, the warrior vanished. Seung-jun sat on the edge of Ao's bed, his forehead pressed against hers, his eyes wet with unshed tears. He held her hands as if they were made of glass. "I almost lost you," he whispered, his voice breaking. The man who owned half of Seoul was now a man who realized his entire world began and ended with the woman in the hospital bed. Under a canopy of string lights and the glittering Seoul skyline, Seung-jun dropped to one knee. He held a diamond that rivaled the city lights. Ao stood in an emerald gown, her hands over her mouth, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. "You made me human again," he said, his voice steady with a rare, hopeful smile. "Stay with me. Forever." The garden was a riot of white roses and orange Nigerian alamanda flowers. Ao was radiant in a white lace gown with traditional gold embroidery, her hair decorated with Nigerian beads. Seung-jun stood in a white suit with a traditional Korean vest, looking at her as if she had created the stars. Their families sat together, a beautiful, unlikely union of two worlds brought together by a love that refused to be denied. 8 months later, the fusion restaurant was the hottest spot in Seoul. Ao stood in the kitchen, her chef coat stretched tight over her prominent round belly. She was glowing, a hand resting on her hip as she managed the dinner rush. In the doorway, Seung-jun watched her with a mixture of anxiety and fierce pride, his jacket in hand, ready to wrap her in his protection the moment she stepped away from the stove. The story concludes in the penthouse at golden hour. Ao sat on the couch, cradling their newborn daughter, a beautiful baby with caramel skin and soft black curls. Seung-jun sat beside them, his arm around Ao's shoulders, his finger gently touched by the baby's tiny hand. The scars were still there, the past was still there, but as the sun set over Seoul, Han Seung-jun was no longer a man of violence. He was a father, a husband, and a man finally at peace.